As noted, I'm Director General of the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute, KNMI. I also still have a professorship at the University of Twente here in the Netherlands. And I was an advisory board member in the first term of the advisory board. So if you can show the next slide. So this report was one of the last two products of that first term. And these are my colleagues. We were established, as most of you will probably know, as part of the European climate law as a point of reference for the scientific knowledge relating to climate change, with an independent role from a scientific perspective to advise the European Union on its climate policy. And an important milestone in our first term was the advice on the 2040 target on the mitigation side, but clearly adaptation is also within the policy challenges we have to address as a European Union. And this last report was the most prominent one on adaptation, although the topic did also come back in other reports, including the agriculture report, for instance. If you can show the next slide. So the first term just ended. I didn't make myself available for a second term, given that I'm now, although I'm leading a scientific institute, it's also technically a government function. When I joined the European Scientific Advisory Board, I was still in the previous role. I felt to emphasize the independence of the board, it would be better to not apply for a second term. And there's been, and I think it's also healthy for a scientific advisory board like this, quite a lot of continuity. So 9 of the 15 members have continued, and there are 6 new members with fresh blood that you can see here on the slide in front of you. So they will be doing the work in the second term. And from the Netherlands, that includes my colleague Detlef, although I should emphasize that none of these experts are speaking from their national capacity. It is really a group of experts with a variety of disciplines that together come to their advice, supported by a secretariat based at the European Environment Agency, but independently providing support to this group of experts. Next slide, please. So this is the core structure of my presentation. I'll briefly outline why Europe needs to adapt. I guess that might be a given for many of you, but just quickly running through the escalating climate risks we're facing and the consequences already for Europe, but also looking into the future. Then the reason why action at the EU level is necessary for an effective response. Of course, there's the question of what is the role of the EU versus countries or even businesses or individuals. So we'll quickly outline that. And then I'll come to the recommendations of the report, the policy gaps we've identified, and the specific recommendations for an effective, fair, and transformational approach to EU adaptation. So let's dive into that. With that first topic, it's clear, and I'll, if I can have the next slide. I won't go into all of these details, but I guess it's familiar to you that we are already in a changed climate today. The UN Secretary General also stressed for the first time, I think it was a scientific reality for a longer period already, but it's now also a diplomatic reality, that we will not hold the line on the 1.5 degrees target from the Paris Agreement. In Europe, we are already facing significantly higher temperature rise, of the order of 2.4 degrees so far, and an inevitable continued warming for a while to come, even if we have the most successful mitigation scenarios that we can imagine right now. So while that warming is taking place, of course, we're feeling the associated consequences, including the long-term trends that we had expected to go along with that warming, such as sea level rise, but in particular also, and I would say in a faster mode than we had expected in science, say 25 years ago, the rapid increase in extreme events. And that is already costing Europe significantly, of the order of $45 billion in damages the past 5 years. So there's the physical assets, but of course that has tremendous additional consequences for people's safety and security, for things like business continuity, for the investment climate in specific countries. It has solidarity implications. So there are a whole range of consequences we're already dealing with today, even with this still, by what we might face in the future, relatively mild climate change that we've seen so far. And just to remind you once again, we are now approaching that 1.5 limit in the Paris Agreement, which we had set based on science, partly because we felt until there, risks would be somewhat manageable. After that, they would become more difficult to tackle. So that's the territory that we're in for the coming decades. Next slide, please. So I guess this is also the sort of familiar graph that you will have seen before. We are already significantly warmed so far, but there's definitely more to come. And those paths depend, of course, on our choices on the emission of greenhouse gases, not just in Europe, but around the world. So that it's depend on our diplomacy and collective action around the world. But we are on a better path than we would have been without the action on the energy transition after the Paris Agreement. But we are still way off from that target. And we have to count on significant continued climate change as we go forward. The current warming trends that we are on with the current emissions trajectories are roughly consistent with the IPCC SSP2 4.5 scenario, and that would imply that we'd end up with about 4 degrees of warming in Europe. So this is not the global warming as specified in the Paris Agreement, but the regional warming that we'd be facing in Europe. This is reflected also in the 2.4 degrees that we've already had with the 1.4 degrees global temperature rise we faced so far. But a business as usual emissions pathway scenario for Europe would be 4 degrees of warming that we would face here, with, of course, the associated consequences, which partly are an increased range of extreme events, for instance, that we've seen so far. But in some cases, we're going to be hitting limits to adaptation as well. It will make it harder to adapt, and where incremental approaches will no longer work. Next slide. So that brings me to the second part of the presentation on why we need European action. So it's not just a matter of everyone facing consequences. A very important realization is that if everyone just does their things on their own, we have a suboptimal response. It's something that we need to do together, and that applies from individuals to cities, for instance, to countries, but it also applies from countries to the EU. So it's clear that, and next slide, please. We have a range of increasing hazards from that climate change that, again, has already occurred so far, and we're dealing with those consequences today. So this is partly about risk management as we speak, but that will continue over the coming decades. And they're interacting with other drivers of climate risk, and that is sometimes seen as a reason to sort of neglect climate risks. You know, there's other things like people are moving to other places. We have an aging population. Aren't those things the real causes for the impacts that we're seeing so far? And of course, the honest answer is that we're seeing a combination of these, and the risk is defined by the combination of the changing climate hazards and the extent that we're exposed, the vulnerability of people and assets, and the responses we take to manage those that exposure and vulnerability. And together, that then determines what sort of impacts and risks we'll be facing. Economic impacts, the uneven impacts across member states and society. This is, of course, also a concern that implies an EU responsibility. Ecosystem disruption and biodiversity loss, which also affects other European targets we already have. Agriculture and food system disruptions, infrastructure damage, energy, water, transport, buildings. And then importantly, also cascading and transboundary effects. So we're seeing effects ripple through these different sectors, but also through different countries. And the energy shocks that we faced recently, for instance, just after the start of the latest phase of the Ukraine war, we had an energy crisis in Europe. We also had a heat wave that summer. And then we saw, and by the way, the French nuclear reactors were, a few of them were under maintenance. And then we had record low water levels in the reservoirs for hydropower from Norway to Italy. We couldn't use the nuclear energy to the fullest extent because the cooling water was getting too warm and it was causing environmental problems in those rivers. Some of the rivers were so low that we couldn't even transport coal to coal-fired energy plants anymore in Germany at that point. And then the combination of all those different pressures together creates a much bigger problem, in that case, a huge spike in electricity costs than each of these individual challenges, partly non-climate related and partly climate aggravated on their own. So that then threatens EU policy efforts on the single market and competitiveness, on EU cohesion, on EU security and preparedness, on EU environmental objectives, and in the end also, of course, on our climate objectives, which themselves can also be threatened by the impacts of climate that we're already facing. Next slide, please. So that means that adaptation will be essential for many of the EU's strategic goals, and that adaptation will be a combination of locally led, local and regional actors that are facing barriers to adaptation, that are doing their own adaptation, but are sometimes facing barriers. National action that then can support them and can set the policy context for that local action. But that alone cannot address the transboundary risks and the barriers that we're facing at a European scale. So that's where the EU level action comes in, that can provide coherence and adaptation planning across policies, regions and governance levels. It includes, for instance, also a level playing field for businesses that are coming to grips with these risks across regions. Long-term stability through an EU level policy direction that provides clarity for the longer term for countries, but also for businesses. Economies of scale in data, investment in climate services. This is something I come across in my day job at the Netherlands Met Service all the time. I could never provide the services to the Dutch citizens if it weren't for the very effective European collaboration. For instance, in Copernicus, in the joint weather monitoring satellites that we have to Copernicus, but also in EUMETSAT, the joint modeling we do through the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasts and its long-term climate reanalyses. These are public goods that we create and that we can only create at a global scale that allow, for instance, my Met Service to deliver safety and security to Dutch citizens and vital economic information to Dutch businesses. We can only do that because we're doing it at a European scale. And in fact, we're also providing global public goods that are used, for instance, across Africa. So they're also part of our climate diplomacy. Of course, there's an issue of resilience of EU-wide systems. I already gave that example of electricity systems being very connected, but there are many examples like that. And finally, that question of solidarity across regions with uneven capacity and exposure. And we're already facing some of those support mechanisms for the urgent and immediate disasters. But if you look at the patterns of impacts and risks that we can expect, this is going to be a growing question. So this requires a combined and coordinated effort across governance levels as well as across sectors, and that means there is a role for the European Union and thus for the European Commission to set some direction that will in the end also help national action and help local and regional actors do what's most effective to deal with the rising risks. Next slide, please. So that brings me to the 5 recommendations for an effective, fair and transformational EU climate adaptation policy framework. And this, of course, speaks to the policy development that is currently happening in DG Klima, and that should be landing over the course of this year. So this is also in that sense a timely report. If we can have the next slide. So what you see here on the right are the sort of 6 building blocks for an effective approach to climate resilience by design. And the first element there is to really lead with a vision. We are looking for, we're looking at a landscape that is throwing huge challenges at us, but challenges that are quite scattered in terms of all the places where they need to be addressed. And that are sometimes easily dismissed because there's always another thing that also interacts with it and that requires urgent policy attention on its own. And what we need is a European vision that cuts through that sort of messy landscape and allows us to set that long-term trajectory. And that's then related to that second principle of anticipate and act. What will happen in practice if we do not develop that vision and if we do not have that coherent policy framework is that we will respond to what's coming our way. And that's a very costly approach, which will just have us responding to more and more disasters as time passes. And we've seen the economic price, the price in terms of lives, but often also the political price of the events that we could, in a way, have seen coming to some extent, could have seen coming on a climate timescale, sometimes could also have seen on an early warning timescale, but we're not able to act effectively on, like the devastation in the Aar Valley and in Belgium at the same time, like the devastation in Valencia, and more recently, the wildfires in Southern Europe, the flooding in Portugal recently. I mean, you could go on and on with these examples. So unless we anticipate and act in advance, we'll be responding to more and more of this. It will not be efficient, and we will politically increasingly be held to account, but we'll also see the economic and security impacts of that. Third important element here is, and maybe I should emphasize again that anticipate and act is across all timescales. So we have work to do to beef up our early warning systems today and to be more effective, also across borders, but also at the national level. There's work to do also to then prepare populations for unprecedented events that we haven't yet seen, but that we can see coming. But there's also the question of the longer term aspirations, and I'll come back to that in our specific recommendations, where we need to anticipate how things will continue to change over the coming decades. We'll need to do that by learning and improving. This is not going to be a simple, the classical picture of adaptation when I started in this field about 25 years ago was that adaptation was sort of translating a level of global warming into a certain amount of sea level rise. And then by the time that sea level rise would have appeared, say in a scenario for 2100, we, the Netherlands as a low-lying delta, would have needed to make sure that we would have added as much to our seawalls as the sea level rise. And then we'd stay at the same level of safety. That's a very long-term, predictable, gradual, and sort of plannable approach to adaptation. In practice, as I already mentioned, the challenges we're facing are quite scattered and quite complicated. We get problems often also with trade-offs. The Netherlands, for instance, facing both increasing drought and increasing extreme rainfall. Much more difficult to tackle that than just that plain sea level rise. The sea level rise is now interacting with drought so that we get increasing salinity coming into the country. How do you deal with those types of trade-offs? Of on the one hand, water safety, and on the other hand, provision of water in times of drought. So what we'll need is creativity also and engagement with lots of different actors. And we'll need to learn and improve as we go. Flexibility is going to be an element of that, but also learning as we go. On the one hand, having that long-term vision and that perspective of what we need to adapt to, but also learning how we do that as we go along. Fourth principle is a just and fair resilience approach. There will be winners and losers within individual communities, within societies, but also across the European Union. And we need to make decisions. We have systems, social protection systems in individual countries, but also mechanisms in Europe. Are we just going to let those mechanisms respond to what's coming our way, or are we going to think about how we do this adaptation imperative that we have here in a way that's just and fair? And finally, the private adaptation component is going to be very important. This is not something that can only be done with public money. It's very much about behavior of individuals, but also businesses. And we need a policy approach that stimulates them to be able to do the right thing. One of the things I mentioned already before is a clear level playing field in terms of how companies respond to risk information. And this is also where institutions like the European Central Bank, for instance, will play an important role. But also institutions like the European Investment Bank that through their investments can also set standards for how businesses adapt. If that is more coherent across different countries, that also has a positive spin-off for the investment climate in Europe as a whole, because people will know that they have a coherent framework in which to make their businesses decisions. And finally, the integration of all of these different elements is going to be critical. So those were the 6 sort of principles that underline the five recommendations that we phrased, that I will go through in the subsequent slides one by one that you see on the left. So if I can have the next slide. These were the principles I just ran through. So we've had this. If I can have the next slide, then we'll go through the 5 recommendations. So the first one is to mandate and harmonize climate risk assessments. So we have had the European Climate Risk Assessment that provides a sort of broad overview, but it doesn't specify how countries or even companies would assess their climate risk. And it would be important to establish some sort of coherence in this across at least the EU policies and funding. So we are working toward that level playing field for everyone. Our advice is to do that with common climate scenarios based on the best scientific evidence. These would need to be co-developed. There are different approaches in different member states to how climate scenarios are currently constructed. You wouldn't want to go to a lowest common denominator approach, but you would want to develop something that takes the best from all of the member states and comes up with a consolidated approach. There are discussions, for instance, already in the Copernicus Climate Service domain to work together on this and to establish this common set of climate scenarios. Methodological standards would go along with this for climate risk assessments. Of course, the climate scenario is only the beginning, the hazard side. How do you apply that to actually assess risk? And then strengthening the adaptation planning across sectors and governance levels. Again, how do you incorporate how do you connect your risk assessments to your adaptation planning? And then finally, that integration of climate risk management by corporates and financial organizations. And that again feeds back also to the role of the European financial institutions. Next slide, please. So diving a little bit deeper into that suggestion of common scenarios, those scenarios are not just a temperature pathway. So what we would construct together would be a scenario approach that then provides the information of a range of climate variables that would need to be adapted to in a coherent way. But as a building block for that, we are strongly advising that the EU would adopt at least a common minimum reference scenario for adaptation planning. And what we are suggesting is that this would be on a pathway to 2.8 to 3.3 degrees of global warming. So once again, this is not the 4 degrees in Europe. This is the global warming equivalent to the Paris Agreement targets by 2100. And that then translates to an even much higher, more even than 4 degrees I mentioned before, warming in Europe. So what we are suggesting is to use a more adverse emission pathway for that, like the SSP 3.7 for the stress testing, where you can then also assess if you have that common reference scenario, you will be optimized. But what if we are in a worse scenario, would your adaptation solutions then still hold? So that if you have very critical risks, you can consider even higher levels of adaptation. This is a point of contention. We had a lot of discussion about this also in the advisory board, because partly you're suggesting that you're sort of giving up on the classical Paris Agreement aligned approach, where we know we have work to do even if we stick with the Paris Agreement, but are we giving up here on mitigation? And of course, the message is far from that. If you do this work, you see what a price we pay if we do not get on the lower targets. But at the same time, science is pointing to the fact that we really cannot rule out the question that we would go here. And the price we pay if we have not adapted, if we get to those higher levels of warming, would be huge. So it's like a precautionary principle to include a higher level of warming in a prescribed common climate scenario. That then allows us to manage risk. And we will not be managing all risks away. We will not be getting back to a previous level of safety, but we will be optimizing our decisions, reflecting on the fact that this is a potential future. I'd also like to point out that this level of warming in a common reference scenario is not just because we think we will be on that greenhouse gas emissions pathway. It's also taking into account the range of uncertainty around the expected climate response to whatever mitigation scenario we would be in. And in that light, again, weighing all the evidence, our suggestion would be to at least prescribe something along the lines of the SSP 4.5 IPCC scenario, and that's 2.8 to 3.3 degrees of global warming. Once again, the translation of those global temperature trajectories into European parameters that then wouldn't be used for adaptation is something that would be a collective exercise. Next slide, please. So the third recommendation is about a vision and targets for a climate resilient European Union. This would be a clear and also legally grounded vision that would be set in the EU's governance framework, which can then strengthen policy coherence across governance levels and align action both with the science base that we've sketched here, but also other EU commitments. Once you have that clarity in one prescribed legal framework, you will see this then reflected in a whole range of other policy domains where you get that coherence that we're after. At present, we feel the EU's vision on adaptation is still too general and therefore doesn't drive that consistent and also accountable action across those different domains. So our advice would be set a clear vision for a climate resilient Europe that would then be translated into sectoral strategies and also measurable adaptation targets, including for 2030 and 2040. So you'll be able to measure your progress also against such a framework. It would be for policymakers to design that vision. I think this is something that would be important to consider, what is our aspiration here? And that's in the end a political decision. But we would say it would be important to base it on the common reference for adaptation planning, be grounded in science, consider EU values that relates to some of the impacts that we're facing that I sketched in the first part of my presentation, and the EU international commitments. And then once again, incorporate some sort of a periodic review so that you can see whether the vision is still in line with the EU ambitions and whether any developments in how the climate evolves, but also how the adaptation practice is evolving, inform whether the vision needs additional refinement, whether we are well on track or whether it needs to become more powerful in light of the expected impacts that we'll be seeing in the coming decades. A fourth target, next slide please, is about integration in all EU policies and investments with clear roles and accountability across governance levels. And that includes that element of a fair and just transition. Not just, that's a concept that's been discussed on the mitigation side very often, but this also applies on the adaptation side. There will be winners and losers, both of the impacts, but also of the way we adapt to them. And it's important to take account of that. I already mentioned in the underlying principles that it will be important to make this an iterative process. So attention for monitoring, evaluation and learning as we adapt, and to evaluate both the EU policy instruments, but also the practice across all governance levels and practice will be an important element of that. And of course, you can also keep track in that monitoring, evaluation and learning of the way both the impacts are playing out, but particularly also your policy interventions are playing out in terms of whether they are considered fair. Next slide, please. So the final recommendation is about mobilizing public and private investment. This advice would be to use the EU's economic governance framework to embed climate risk management in national economic and fiscal planning. And again, this is about the consistency also across the EU so that we have that level playing field for businesses, but also for governments, and have that science-based grounding of how we do climate risk management to then also retain the solidarity that we're in this together. That would include the next MFF. So how do we strengthen the climate resilience ambitions by the right investments there? It also includes the efforts to mobilize and align private finance with climate resilience objectives. And there is a carrot and stick approach. You do want to set certain standards to have, for instance, that common climate reference scenario that can also guide risk assessments that investors might be using. But there's, of course, also the element of making it attractive for private business to invest in climate resilience objectives. There will be business opportunities around this as well. And for instance, the EU data ecosystem is an element of that. There's the recommendation to support efforts to address the climate insurance protection gap. We are increasingly seeing that insurers are getting hesitant to insure risks that are rising, whereas insurance can be a very important buffer for private individuals, but also businesses to deal with the rising climate risks. And finally, and that's an urgent one already today, strengthening the EU crisis response and recovery instruments. We are already facing the climate impacts that the 2.4 degrees of warming that we have in Europe right now are bringing us. That will escalate, and we will need to be better supporting each other also across the European Union in crisis response and recovery. And the wildfires are an example of that. So there's an opportunity for this, for instance, and it's very interesting to see DG ECHO, for instance, also playing a role now, developing this climate risk management and resilience approach for the EU. And some people have, again, just like adaptation has sometimes been seen as giving up on mitigation, talking about crisis management is by some seen as giving up on effective adaptation. The honest answer, science-based, is at this point, we cannot afford an either or. It's going to be all of the above. And the question is, how do we bring them together in one vision and deliver them with synergy for the European Union? Thank you very much.